Hey guys, Ned DeHaan from blackboxonlineradio here. In this episode, I'm going to play an interview that I did with Mike Morford, talking all about his Zodiac Killer suspect, William MacDuff Andrew. And some of you may have noticed that I've been doing more interviews on Black Box Online Radio recently, talking about the Zodiac Killer, but also about D.B. Cooper on the Cooper Friday segment. But to be honest, I miss doing the Zodiac Killer news report where I can respond to all of the great things that you guys have been sending me. So in this episode, I wanted to make it a combination of both of them. And if you go down to the quick reference in the comments section, you can see the different topics that are arranged. First, I'm going to play the interview with Morph, and then I will do the Zodiac Killer news report. And let's get started.
BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, everybody. Today is Monday, another Zodiac Monday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? I hope everyone had a good weekend. This week on Zodiac Monday, I have the pleasure of being joined by Mike Morford, also known as Morph, and we're going to be talking all about the Zodiac Killer and his suspect, MacDuff. Morph is one of the co-hosts of the Citizen Detective podcast, and he has also worked with the Criminology podcast, and he's in loads of other places on YouTube. Morph, how you doing?
I'm doing good. Thanks for having me on. Good to talk to you again, then.
Yes, always a pleasure. Now, Morph, can you just provide a very small introduction as to what made you curious about the Zodiac Killer mystery years ago?
Well, for me, it started in high school. I read a book that had the Zodiac Lake Berryessa drawings on it and stuff. And for me, that was really fascinating as a teenager in the 80s when there was lots of, slasher movies and stuff out. It just sort of jumped out to me. And then I read about it. It just seemed creepy that somebody would do something like that. And I did a book report in school about the case. And my teacher wasn't too thrilled that I picked that as subject matter, but it was also, during that time the Zodiac book came out by Graysmith, so I had bought that, and it just sort of kicked off my true crime interest, and Unsolved Mysteries was out, so I was into that. So it just sort of snowballed, and I've really been hooked on the case and in true crime in general ever since.
Wow, fascinating. Now, in 2021, you brought forward a new Zodiac Killer suspect, and I guess it's fair to say you made the discovery about William MacDuff Andrew. We simply call him MacDuff, I guess, suspect MacDuff. And is it true that you made some posts about suspect MacDuff and you were contacted by law enforcement and they told you to take down your info?
So what actually happened, there's a little bit of people have said stuff without really knowing what they're talking about on the internet. I had reached out to law enforcement and provided some details and some information about them. And somebody that I knew in law enforcement reached out to me and suggested that I don't put his information out there. So that's where the bringing it down, taking it down came from. And I sort of my fault. I was on another podcast talking about Mac before I revealed his name and everything, and I had inadvertently put some information out there about him. At the time I wasn't, thinking all the way about what, somebody might find with him and be able to link it back to him. But somebody actually linked something I said on the podcast and was able to find him, and they sort of, internet trolls put his name out there. It was sort of before I was ready. I was hoping to behind the scenes just keep him to myself and weed him out and off the list and move on to somebody else. But they threw his name out there, so I sort of got stuck talking about him publicly on some of the forums and Twitter and stuff like that as a result of that.
Okay, wow, really interesting. And yes, I mean, it's kind of almost like confusing about how sometimes people can say the most ridiculous things in the comments sections, but when it comes to putting two and two together and tracking down somebody that you don't want revealed yet, oh, they're very good at that. It's kind of this interesting contrast that we live with.
Oh, absolutely.
So at what stage are you with your investigations and research into suspect MacDuff?
So I'm sort of at a standstill at this point because his wife was cooperating a little bit. Of course, she said, "Oh, you're crazy. There's no way he was Zodiac." But she gave us a little bit of tidbits, and the tidbits she gave us, such as where he went to college in '68, when he came back, what he helped us find more pictures of him. She gave us a little bit of writing, and the writing she gave us looked a little bit like Zodiac. So that didn't roll him out. But then she said that he didn't have any more writing available, that his writing was destroyed, something like along those lines. So we're sort of in a wait holding pattern because there's not much else I can get. There'd be a treasure trove I could get if we could, if his wife was willing to say, "Hey, let me get his social security abstract." That would list every place he ever paid taxes to, every job he ever had, so we could find out, hey, where did he work? What years did he work there? And sort of get a little bit more of a put him on the map, so to speak. But without that, without somebody coming forward that knew him personally and saying, hey, here's what I know about him. This is where he, what he was doing. I was his friend back then. Without any more of those people coming forward, we're at a standstill. So now we're sort of finding newspaper clips. There's a guy named Andrew on ZodiacKiller.com on the forum. He's really good at finding new articles, and they sort of, some of them link to, Zodiac-esque stuff. Like he found an article that said Mac returned home on December 20th, 1968 to visit his parents. Well, we know when the first Lake Herman Road murders happened. So just little things like that seem to continue to just tick little boxes for him. And, every once in a while they'll pop up, we'll find some more things. But until somebody comes forward with that treasure trove of information, we're sort of in a holding pattern.
Okay, and would you say that MacDuff is still your top suspect as of now?
100%.
Oh, 100%. So
I'm 100%. I'm not 99%. I'm 100% sure he's the guy.
Okay, 100%. And what is so convincing about MacDuff as a suspect for you?
Because it was just too many things. The proximity to the phone booth, overall physical description fits. 26 to 30-year-old, as Majot mentioned, big round face. Handwriting that's similar. Just a list of things. A cousin in Deer Lodge dying there in 1969 when Zodiac mentions it at Lake Berryessa. It just too many things. And then you've got the handwriting that looks similar, interest in ciphers. He's so interested in a cipher book, he buys a second copy of it. There's a possible Zodiac card, what is it, 2 hours, 100 miles away from Vallejo in Eureka, possible Zodiac mailing. And lo and behold, Mac owns property there. To me, it got to a point where it's just, there's too much here to be coincidence. And I'm of the belief that, so many things you could just say, okay, that's a coincidence, but it gets to a point where I can't say that anymore. And I'm 100% convinced it's him. And I'm just excited, hoping that they find some DNA and can do genealogy, because I'm betting when they solve the case, if they solve it, I'm going to be proven right.
All right, and for the audience, the Zodiac Killer was a serial killer who operated in California in 1968 and 69.
Sorry about that, Ed.
Oh, it's okay. The Zodiac was a serial killer that operated in California in 1968 and 69. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. And because the Zodiac commits the first crimes, the Lake Herman Road murders on December 20th of 1968, are you prepared to kind of give us a breakdown about what you think happened, what drove Mac to kill, why did he choose that location, why that night? And I know that this is some very abstract stuff, but because it requires speculation and hypothesizing, is that something you would like to do?
I can tell you, so let me step back a little bit. So I reached out, I got a handful of names of people that I knew Mac. This is going back a year, 2021 or whatever year it was. And I put this list of names of everybody that was, attended a wedding with him, went to college with him, et cetera, et cetera. And there's, I forget how many names are on the list, like 10 people. And I reached out to all 10 of them, and I got a response back from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people, I think, that knew him. 5 people never responded. The 4 or 5 that knew him were friends of his that he lived in Chico with when he was going to Chico State College. And they lived in, they were roommates with him. And they all told me, and I just want to say straight up, none of them said, oh my God, I always knew he was a serial killer. There was nothing like that. I don't want to misrepresent what they said. All of them were surprised, and I didn't really tell them till the end that I thought he was the Zodiac Killer, because I wanted to see what they thought about him, straight up without me saying that. None of them said they thought he was a serial killer, but all of them said he was a little bit odd. He didn't date. Things like that. He sort of, while they all went off for careers and marriages and stuff like that, he sort of got left behind and was sort of, I don't know that he was an underachiever, but these guys are going off. I think one of them was a teacher, one of them became a cop. They're all going off, having careers, getting married, and Max left behind with no real career, no significant other. He didn't date at all, which back in the late 60s, early 70s, that was just the summer of love, and people were, having sexual relations and stuff like that with other people pretty easily, and relationships and stuff. So he wasn't successful in dating or having any of that, according to all the friends I talked to. And that sort of fit into a long time belief of mine and many others that Zodiac was like sort of a quasi incel before that existed, someone that wanted to be out with other people on a date, and was he coveted that, and he couldn't have that, and he was someone that would patrol these lovers lane areas looking for young couples that did have that. So he fit that part to a T. And that was sort of early on, them telling us that sort of said, okay, he fits that part. He's not somebody that got married, had a relationship, was doing, off with a career and stuff, and too busy to be the Zodiac. It was the complete opposite. Well, these guys all said they lost track of him because they went on with marriages and things like that. He didn't. He was sort of stuck there on his own, and a couple of them would see him at weddings, and they one of them remarked he was surprised eventually when he became a prison guard, because he didn't see him in that kind of role. But Mac eventually became a prison guard. So Mac didn't have his first relationship with anyone until 1974. And it's interesting with Mac's timeline, and anybody can go back and listen to some of the old episodes they did or check the forum. But there's a big stall in Zodiac's known timeline of writing letters. It's 1971 and 1974. In 1971, Mac takes a job with the state. The Zodiac letters stop. 1974, Mac meets his wife, future wife. The Zodiac letters start again. Those line up perfectly with stressors in Mac's life, and serial killers have stressors. And they can be the birth of a child, a new job, losing a job, any of that stuff, buying a house, any of those things. They're big things that affect serial killers in different ways. It may result in them killing, not killing. The Golden State Killer, I love to use this as an example. They were looking for stressors, potential stressors in his life that coincided with attacks. The Golden State Killer didn't attack from 1981 to 1986. Here we find out in 1981, his first daughter. In 1986, his second daughter is born. He goes back out and kills, first murder in 5 years. So these are real things that serial killers do. They're stressors that, in Mac's case, they line up with Zodiac's start and stop in writing letters. And they line up with big things in his life, his career starting, and his marriage starting with his first relationship.
Okay, though. So with the quasi-incel statement. Is this like a fair way of reshaping it? Because when we're talking about the Zodiac, some people like to say that the Zodiac Killer was most likely driven by heterosexual animosity, meaning that he was a straight male and maybe 20s or 30s, but not able to form romantic relationships. And it just reached a breaking point. And the reason why he created the entire Zodiac persona was because, well, he was sexually frustrated. Maybe you could even say rage-filled. Is that like a fair assessment?
I'm not an expert in that. It's my personal belief, and I know that's a thing that's been out there for a while. I know some experts have thought that, and it's not to say all single people or all incel people are going to become serial killers. That I'm not saying that at all, but it's just one more thing about him that sort of fits the old belief by many people.
Right, so the question was like about what would be the motive for the Lake Hermit Road murders? Why did it happen? Just somebody who sees like two teenagers in a car and is just like pissed off, so he decides to, well, shoot them, murder them, and it's done in sort of I guess driven by rage.
Yeah, I'd really be speculating. I try not to do that. I'm just sort of going where the facts, the timeline goes of Mac to Zodiac. I can't venture to guess what would make him do this if he was Zodiac. Why it tipped him over the edge at that point, I don't know. Loneliness. Maybe he had gone to several friends' weddings, never his own. And maybe that was just too much for him. And coming home to visit his parents that weekend in 1968, maybe he just was at the edge and he saw this couple out there, and he maybe had been thinking about this for a while, and he acted on it. I don't know the reasons why, what pushed him over the edge. But again, I just look at the timeline and what's going on with Mac, and it just lines up too well with what's going on with Zodiac.
Okay, though, so would you like to go through some of the possible unconfirmed Zodiac events, and let's see how it matches up with a suspect like MacDuff?
Sure.
Firstly, do you believe that any of the pre-canonical crimes that happened in the 1960s before Lake Herman Road were the Zodiac Killer?
So for a long time, I was a proponent of the Zodiac being in Riverside. I can't tell you how many hours of my life I've devoted to like the Riverside crime specifically, because I just thought the letters were too similar. I thought there was no way he's using the same words and phrases in that Riverside case. Even if he didn't kill Sherry, I thought he sent the letters in that case. So I'm spending hours and hours and hours of my life linking people from Riverside that lived in Riverside in the 60s and later lived in Vallejo, and I got a list together of people. And eventually, another police friend of mine said, listen, focus on the crimes Zodiac committed. Don't waste too much time on the ones that you don't know about, because you might be spinning your wheels. Focus on the crime. So that's how I found Mac in the first place. I sort of said, okay, let me set Riverside aside and just look at the confirmed Zodiac things. And it wasn't until I reread the article in one of those True Detective magazines that laid out, word for word what had happened in Riverside. The phrases, the words, the complete breakdown of what happened in Riverside was in this True Detective magazine from, the late 60s that would have been available to somebody in Vallejo. And that's when it hit me that, hey, this guy doesn't need to have been in Riverside, because he's reading this stuff right in the magazine, word for word, misspelling for misspelling. And at that point, I realized that it was very possible that Zodiac was never in Riverside. And I was someone that for a long time believed he had to have been in Riverside. And now I know that he didn't have to have been in Riverside. He, could have easily read it in these detective magazines. So I sort of, took that new approach that not all these pre-canonical known Zodiac crimes are, connected, that they are definitely Zodiac crimes. So some of those crimes pre-confirmed Zodiac crimes are interesting. There's some similarities, obviously. Domingos Edwards has some similarities to like Berryessa. The letters in the Bates case, obviously, you can go back to the Ray Davis case. I mean, there's definitely some things of interest that, are worth looking at Zodiac in the cases. But at the end of the day, there's nothing that confirms them, unless behind the scenes there's DNA or something, that fingerprints that say, hey, this same person was Zodiac. There is none of that in any of those cases. So while you can look to see if some of those cases could be connected, there's nothing that confirms that they are. And as far as Mac goes, Mac was never in Southern California for any of the Southern California crimes. So if it was ever proven that Sherry Jo Bates or Domingos Edwards or any of those other crimes in Southern California, if it was proven that they were Zodiac, that would rule Mac out because he was never in Southern California. And now I'm looking with new fresh eyes and saying there's nothing in any of those cases that connects positively to Zodiac, especially the Riverside case, because that was all in a magazine that the real Zodiac and Vallejo could have easily read. So for me, I'm not looking so much at those earlier crimes, although they're interesting in their own. I don't believe that they're Zodiac because I believe 100% that Mac is Zodiac.
So we've been having some discussions here on Zodiac Monday, as well as on Jerome's channel and some other places on YouTube, about the communications that came after the murder of Sherry Jo Bates. She is murdered on October 30th of 1966. Then we have the Riverside Confession coming in November. In December, they discover the desktop poem that talks about some morbid incident. She's not named in the desktop poem, but she is named in the confession. Then we have the 3 letters that come in the spring of 1967, the Bates Had to Die letters or the loose leaf letters. Do you think any of those communications were written by the Zodiac Killer?
Well, being that I think Mac was the Zodiac and I don't think he was ever in Southern California, no, I don't think any of those were written by him. And, here we have this, for a long time I was convinced, okay, here we have a handwriting expert that's said all these letters in the Bates case are from Zodiac. And then we have this fiasco where, no, a teenager came forward and admitted pranking, a cruel hoax in at least the Bates Had to Die letters. So now that just strengthens my case that, hey, this is probably not Zodiac down there, because the expert Sherwood Morrill was wrong, because we know that because of a person that wrote those letters came forward and admitted that they wrote them. So the things that sort of held, strength for Zodiac being in Riverside, are sort of shifting. The handwriting is falling apart as that being a link. So, just to me, it just strengthens the case that none of that stuff in Southern California was likely Zodiac.
And that actually ties right into my next question. Do you believe that the 2021 news statement about how the Bates Had to Die letters were written by a hoaxer is true? Do you think the hoaxer actually did it?
Well, I let me just say that I'm a big supporter of law enforcement in general. I work with a lot of different detectives, retired, current, talk to a lot of police. I support the police. It's hard work. And but I've been a long time critic of Riverside. I think from the very beginning they handled Sherry's case poorly from the minute she was killed until now. So even their news release of explaining what had happened was poorly written. They couldn't even take the time to do that right. So I believe, as confusing as their press release, I believe they identified the person that wrote those letters the way they say they did, and it wasn't Zodiac. I just believe they could have done a better job explaining it and making it less confusing. Assuming he is the guy that wrote those forgeries and he was a teenager doing a hoax, still doesn't tell us who wrote the confession letter. That's another letter that would be great to see who wrote that. But I don't know what they're doing behind the scenes. I don't know what evidence they're ignoring, what they're not ignoring, what they're looking at. In my case, in my opinion, Sherry Joe's case should have been solved by now. They have DNA in the case. I don't know what's taking so long. Is there enough to do a full profile? Who knows? They're not saying anything. They've been locked in on a suspect who they think is the killer for 50 years now.
You mean Bob Burnett?
Yes. And unless they've suddenly changed their mind and they've gone off him, I don't think they have. I think they still got tunnel vision for him. So, if you have DNA there that doesn't belong to Bob Burnett, why are you still looking at Bob Burnett? Move him to the back burner. You don't have to stop looking at him, but just keep him on the back burner. Find out who the DNA belonged to that was in Sherry's hand on her person. Ken Maines. I don't know if you watch Ken Maines at all, but he's got some of the access to some of the DNA stuff and to Sherry Joe's clothing. And he, has put out a recent video, and I didn't watch the full video, and I didn't, I sort of skimmed through it, so I don't want to say anything and get it wrong, but people can go out and find the Ken Maines video where he talks about Sherry's clothing and the evidence and stuff. And he doesn't think that the DNA belongs to, I think he said that suspect, but I could be wrong. And he also said it didn't belong to Gary Post, which, I think everybody in the Zodiac world agrees that Gary Post isn't Zodiac, but, so that's where that stands, I think.
Okay, and yes, I did see that video from Ken Maines, and I did a response to it on the Thursday show, Tuesdays and Thursdays here on Black Box Online Radio. You can stop on by for True Crime Talk Radio in the morning with your host, me, Black Box Ned. You can also hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And I would like to remind everybody that I'm talking to Mike Morford, and if you have any ideas for future episodes of Black Box Online Radio, you can put them in the comments section down below. Okay, though, Morph, I do have a very big follow-up about that, because it seemed really quite odd to me when I was watching that Ken Maines video that he said that Gary Post's DNA and also Ted Kaczynski's DNA were tested, but he said it's the DNA that was found on her pants and on the Timex wristband that was found nearby. But he didn't mention anything about the hair that was found in Sherry Joe's blood. Is all of this connected? Is the same person's DNA in all three of these different samples?
You have to ask Riverside that. I have no idea.
Well, they don't like to talk.
Exactly. So for example, if I was running this case, or I'm sure if Ken Maines was running this case, the first thing we would do is see if that stuff on the clothing matches the stuff under her fingernails or in her hand. And I'd say, okay, do we have the same person on her clothes and in her hand? Then all of a sudden that becomes much stronger. It's harder to say she brushed up against somebody that day or something like that. It becomes stronger that the person whose DNA on her pants and in her hand is the killer. So I'd want to know that first. I don't know if Riverside knows that. If they do, they're not saying, but that's the first thing I'd want to know. And then I would say, okay, does this match anybody in the CODIS system? Is there anybody that's been in prison and had their DNA, taken that this matches? And then, after that, I'd say, okay, let's try and do genealogy and see if we can track this person down through genealogy. Now, depending on the state of the DNA, it might not be possible to do that. Might not be able to get a full profile. It might be too degraded. I don't know any of that stuff because they're not talking. But, there's a hair specifically mentioned being found in Sherry's hand. Cigarette butts, things like that around the scene that were collected. The hair specifically, they can get a DNA profile in many cases off a hair that, even if it's rootless, they can extract a DNA profile now. There's a company called Astria that does that. So I don't know what Riverside's doing. If I was Riverside, I'd be sending this stuff off to Australia saying, please, we have a hair here, see if you can get a DNA sample off of it. I don't know that they're in a rush to do that because in my mind, it doesn't matter to do that. And I feel they've had tunnel vision and done Sherry's case a disservice for the last, 60 years.
Okay, yes. So, I mean, I hope that the case will be solved, but it's looking like it's going to get colder and colder. And I mean, I'm trying to always stay optimistic, but just the way that, as you said, the way everything has been handled, there are like just so many doubts that I have because, um, I'm trying to be careful with my words so I don't say something extremely nasty. But um, if we're going to go into a different direction, we talked about the pre-Zodiac crimes. We talked about a little bit about Domingos Edwards and Sherry Joe Bates. But the Zodiac persona then went onward into the 1970s, possibly not committing murders, but writing the letters. When was the final Zodiac letter, in your opinion?
I think it was the last confirmed 74 letter, the Exorcist letter. I personally think that was his last letter. Now, again, we can go back to the whole, how reliable is handwriting. But when I see that, I'm no handwriting expert, and everybody, has their own views on letters. I clearly see Zodiac's writing in that letter. So for me, there's no doubt that Exorcist letter is Zodiac's. Um, there's a couple other ones to me from that year that I don't see Zodiac's writing as much. Some people debate which one might be a fake from that year. I think other people have said that and I don't want to put words in their mouth, but I think some people have said the Zodiac, the Exorcist one might be the fake. I personally don't believe that. I don't think there's any chance that's a fake. But I mean, to me, and I said the Exorcist was the last one. I mean, it was the first one that year, but there's other letters from that year that I think are the Red Phantom letter. I think that's legit Zodiac. The Exorcist letter, I think, is Zodiac. The two that are, a little bit harder for me to make a decision are, the citizen card, the SLA letter. I think those ones to me are not as cut and dry as to whether they're Zodiac. But again, I'm a non-expert, non-handwriting examiner, just looking with my own eyes. So I think if you ask 50 different people, you're going to get, 3 different groups. Some people think it is, some people think it isn't, some people that can't make up their mind. So I think that's the problem when you start looking at handwriting and trying to figure out which one's really Zodiac's. It's not physical evidence. You know what I mean? It's somebody's opinion, and that's why it's not as important as DNA or fingerprints.
Now, last week on Zodiac Monday, I had Aphrodite Jones on the show, and she did one of her most famous episodes of her show True Crime with Aphrodite Jones about the Zodiac Killer. And she had a very big reversal on handwriting experts. If you watch that episode, which is available here on YouTube for free, she's like almost just acting like she's best friends with a handwriting expert. They're just like talking and chilling. And then she's walking her through the process, looking at how she's analyzing the handwriting samples. And Aphrodite Jones said that she had a big reversal. And at a certain point, she just realized that those types of methods are not credible, to the point where she didn't even want to use handwriting analysis in any of her future projects. She said that was the last time because she realized that it wasn't a very reliable method. And you even used the word opinion. Do you agree or disagree with that statement that handwriting analysis and handwriting experts are not that reliable?
I think it's a tool that should be used in police work to help. If you've got 3 different trained, credited handwriting experts that think something is the same person, or 3 that think it's not the same person, I think you can sort of get a consensus by these trained experts, to maybe help you guide your investigation, maybe lower somebody on the list of suspects. But I think you need to rely on physical evidence, DNA, fingerprints, that kind of stuff. That's science. Handwriting is not. It's opinion. So if you've got 3 well-trained people all agreeing one way or another on something, I think that's a good tool to use. I don't think you should rely on just one person. because again, we've seen how many writing experts, Ned, have said that they've matched Zodiac writings, whether it's Nanette Bartow or, Lloyd, I can't think of his other name, his name. Yeah, Arthur Lee Allen. I mean, how many different people have been identified? That the one, in the Earl Van Best case, he identified the preacher that married them. I mean, so you start having all these quote unquote experts on their own giving you an opinion on Zodiac writing and linking it to somebody, and you're all of a sudden we've got 6 different people that have been identified by 6 different, so-called experts. To me, I think, it's a good tool to use. Can't rely on it. And I'd get 3 esteemed experts to sort of be a little panel to say, what do you think of this? If they're all in agreement, to me, that would make it a little bit stronger as to whether or not they're right or wrong. But when you just go out and randomly pick somebody, you're asking for trouble, because, if you base your case just off what a handwriting expert tells you, you're going down the wrong road.
Okay, though, does that mean, though, like, to go back to one statement that you made, do you actually think the final Zodiac letter was the Count Marco letter, the Red Phantom read with rage?
Yeah, and I misspoke. I said it was the Exorcist letter, but I think the Red Phantom letter to me is no doubt Zodiac. So again, just my untrained eye, the writing, the tone there at all, it seems like Zodiac to me. That you can look at the envelope too that the card was mailed in. It has all of that for me. Which again, it brings me back to what's the reason Zodiac paused between March 1971 and January 74 with those letters. Everybody's said has an opinion. Well, he was in jail, or whatever. He was in a mental institution. I mean, all these different reasons, which again sends me back to Mac. Well, here you have a guy that's going to try and get his life together and get this state job. Maybe he's keeping a low profile. I think, and this is one thing I've been able to find out from Mac, I think he's got fingerprints out there someplace on file. Back then, it's not like they were computerized. They would, they check their prints and throw them in a file cabinet someplace. I think at some point he decided to keep a low profile, took a state job, probably gave his fingerprints, and then tried to keep a low profile. And then for 3 years he did that, and he meets his future wife. They get engaged, and that, for whatever reason, is an imbalance in his life, and he starts writing his next letter. He writes the Exorcist letter. So for me, I think, forget trying to diagnose the writing. I want to know why he's writing during those times he is and when he's not.
Okay, though, so we've talked about how handwriting analyses might not be the most credible form of science. But Morph, how do we solve the Zodiac Killer mystery? Is this going to be a DNA case? Is this going to be with fingerprints? Is somebody going to find Paul Stein's wallet in the attic in the possessions of so-and-so? How do we solve the mystery?
In my opinion, it's got to be DNA. At this point, there's nobody that's going to come forward and say, hey, my grandfather gave a deathbed confession. Every couple years, somebody comes forward and says, oh, my grandfather is a Zodiac. My dad was the Zodiac. I mean, we see it time and time again. It's like a broken record. People looking for their 15 minutes of fame for whatever reason that is. But by this point, I think it's safe to say nobody's going to come forward with a smoking gun of their, Zodiac's Berryessa hood was in Grandpa's, belongings. That's not going to happen. I think at some point, Zodiac probably got rid of anything that connected himself to these crimes. Physically, and I don't think he told anybody. I think he the grave. So I don't think there's anybody out there that has information or has evidence to come forward to link the case. So I think at this point, it's going to come down to physical evidence, DNA or fingerprints. And fingerprints, as I mentioned, back then, if you got fingerprinted back in 1969, it wasn't like it is today. You're not going into a computer and everything's in one central base. They'd check your fingerprints against something and then, you know, throw it in a filing cabinet someplace and there'd be no record of it. So I think DNA that can be extracted out of letters and envelopes that Zodiac, you know, sent, and from things he handled, shell casings, Oakland A's tickets that, you know, possibly were from Zodiac. Anything that was handled can be re-examined. Anything that he touched, any envelopes he sealed, anything he held, you know, the bindings at Lake Berryessa, all of that stuff is a potential treasure trove of DNA. And I think they need to, I don't know what they're doing behind the scenes. Again, they don't talk a lot. It's all potentially a treasure trove of potential DNA that could be Zodiac. So if I was handling this case, I'd test every nook and cranny of every letter, every envelope, every shell casing, any hairs they have in this case, anything he touched, the bindings from Lake Berryessa, any of that stuff should be re-examined as a high priority. Any DNA that is taken should be, you know, collected and tried to process that DNA for, you know, for a profile. And then if you can track that to anyone and you have a name, then you can sort of work from there and say, okay, was this person a white male living in that area during that time? You can sort of check people off the list and say, okay, this person fits the profile, and you might be able to whittle it down. And if you're really lucky, maybe they get some strong DNA that's strong enough on two different things, the letter, corridor, the bindings, maybe they match each other. So, you know, okay, Zodiac, this DNA on this letter is the same as on these bindings. We know that's Zodiac. And if you can somehow get a profile and you go back and do genealogy, even if Zodiac died, which I believe he did, then you can still get a name. You can still close this case. You know, if you can make a case against somebody, even if they're dead and buried.
So I want to ask you something very directly. In 2023, Tom Voigt released a video on his YouTube channel, Zodiac Killer Official, that I guess you'd say raised a question more than stating it as a fact, that the fingerprints after the Stein murder, the bloody fingerprints, may not have belonged to the Zodiac Killer, that they might have belonged to the witness named Lindsay Robbins. Do you believe that those are the killer's fingerprints, or the witness walked over to Paul Stein's body, touched him, and then touched the taxi? Which one do you think is more likely?
I'm trying to go back in memory, and I don't necessarily believe what was said about that, because anytime stuff changes over so many years, you know, anybody changing their story, their original account from, you know, I'm not a big fan of that. I believe in what's documented right while it's fresh in their mind on the night it happened is what I go with. I don't like somebody changing their mind 50 years later and saying, you know, all of a sudden this is different and this happened, because people elaborate on stuff, people forget stuff, you know, people get confused. And I tend to think that that's not what happened. I mean, even if you remember what Palisetti said, you know, he said that when he arrived at the scene, the kids were walking towards the cab and he had to stop them. So if they're walking, if he's right, if that's accurate, and they're walking towards the cab from their house and they hadn't gotten there yet, how could he leave a fingerprint on there? So for me, I tend to believe that's not true. I don't think that happened. I don't think that is their print. You know, I think it was most likely Zodiac's. I mean, could there be some strange anomaly where you know, it's an EMT or somebody like that, somebody just careless? I mean, that could happen. But I hope they would have taken the time to check everybody that was on scene, because that and this is almost where I prefer the DNA, because to me that's the most valuable thing in this case. If you can get a DNA profile off one of the backs of those envelopes and it matches other envelopes that were sent, and you know Zodiac licked two of those envelopes, you know he sent it, then to me that almost overrides the print. because now you have his DNA on these different letters, and you can just sort of eliminate the guesswork of, is that print at the crime scene Zodiac's or not? If it's on the letters, if it's on bindings he held, things like that, you know it's his. So there's no need to wonder whose print that was. The DNA to me is the most important piece of this case. So if they can come up with a profile that they're confident is the real Zodiac's, to me that would be the most important thing they could do to solve this case.
And you were asking about a memory check. I mean, it's also been a while since I've watched that video, but I believe that Lindsay Robbins confessed to his son, and he wanted his son to only go forward with that information after he had passed away, because I believe Lindsay Robbins is deceased now, if I remember the story correctly. And then that was why he didn't say anything earlier. And I think that that's so bizarre that he would withhold something like that if it were true, because absolutely nobody would have suspected him of any wrongdoing. I mean, if he, he's one of the witnesses who saw the Zodiac Killer, and if he were to say that he touched the cab, I mean, I don't think anyone would fault him for that. Like, I don't really know what the motive would be to conceal the information, unless he was just embarrassed about it.
And to me, that's the thing. That's the whole second-hand person. The person that supposedly said it is dead. You can't ask them. It's a second-hand person saying, my dad said this, but he didn't want me to come forward to after his death. To me, that all sounds a little fishy. So I don't want to call his son a liar, but to me, I don't believe it.
Okay, Morph, I have a very quick question for you. There's a new Zodiac Killer documentary that's coming out on Netflix in October, and it's called This is the Zodiac Speaking. Not a very good title, in my opinion. Been there, heard that before. But it's going to be about the story of the Seawaters and Arthur Lee Allen, and talking about their personal experiences with Mr. Allen, and how they have witnessed a lot of things that could incriminate Arthur Lee Allen as being the Zodiac Killer. What do you make of their statements?
I'll be skipping the documentary. I don't really put much weight in what they have to say, and I don't think Arthur Lee Allen was in any way Zodiac. So for me, this is just, I've got 2 hours of my life I could do other things with. I won't be watching the documentary.
Okay, though, but you have to admit that Arthur Lee Allen is one of the most widely discussed Zodiac suspects. No matter what type of counter argument you can bring up, he is still perhaps the most widely discussed suspect. Why is Allen not the Zodiac, in your opinion?
Well, all of the physical evidence that we have doesn't match him. The palm print doesn't match him that's found on the letter. Fingerprints in the case don't match him. The ballistics on the guns he owned didn't match any of Zodiac's. The handwriting didn't match. Again, we go back to handwriting. It's just one thing on top of the physical evidence that doesn't match. The DNA that they did, which could be flawed, I'll say that, but the DNA evidence that they did way back in that documentary TV show, that DNA didn't match him. I think they should again rule him out properly if they can. But everything, prints, writing, ballistics, every which way he could be ruled out. He didn't look anything like, we can debate whether somebody looks like the Zodiac sketch or not. Arthur Lee Allen didn't look anything like the Zodiac sketch. So to me, you just take all of that and every which way you can, he's been ruled out in my mind. And not to mention Arthur Lee Allen is a child molester. There's no instance, no proof in any of the Zodiac killings that he had any interest in molesting children. It just clashes with what we know about Arthur Lee Allen. I think Arthur Lee Allen was somebody that liked the attention that he got from it, and I think he liked people thinking he was Zodiac, and it was a way for him to sort of get his excitement when people were thinking that. And I think he probably played up a little bit to it. But again, just every thing that we have in this case that was compared to him doesn't match. So, to me, the show is just another way. The documentary is just another way for somebody to grift the case, make a few bucks, and just get beat the horse one last time for Arthur Lee Allen, because I think it's easy enough that if they have DNA in this case, they can just rule him out properly. Even if they don't have enough DNA to do genealogy, if they have enough DNA to rule a person out by direct comparison, Arthur Lee Allen, he may have, I think he's got brain matter on file or something that they use to do that. Yeah. So one way or another, he could properly be ruled out. If they have any DNA, even if it's not enough to do genealogy, they could do a 1-to-1 comparison and see if it matches him. He could be ruled out really easily. And to me, he's already been ruled out. So for me to devote any more time or energy to watching anything made about him is just going to be a waste of my time.
All right, Morph, you are also one of the hosts of the Citizen Detective podcast, which again, people can get on YouTube for free. And it's a very well done program, and it features the criminologist Dr. Lee Meller, Alex Ralph, and the retired homicide detective Cloyd Steiger, and Susanna Ryan talks a lot about forensics. And you guys cover all types of stories on the Citizen Detective podcast. Now, is there one episode that you did there that was your favorite or you thought was the best presentation? Is there one episode that stands out?
All the cases are so interesting. I mean, you had come on for the Texarkana Phantom episode, and that was sort of like an early Zodiac Killer. That was interesting, but they all interested me in different ways. And one of my pet cases is, a couple of my pet cases that I've long been hoping to be solved. There was a murder of a young girl in Utah. That was one of the ones that really stood out to me. And it's one that I've, sort of been hoping to be solved, Rachel Runyon's case. That's been sticking with me for, since I saw it on Unsolved Mysteries, as a matter of fact. But there's Jeanette Roberson out of Michigan. There's so many fascinating cases. And, when you sit around with a panel of not just experts to discuss the case, but what I really like about the show is we had people that would come on and take part live as we're recording and ask questions, give their theories. When you have that environment where you have people working together, different backgrounds, different skills, and shooting ideas at each other, I think that's such a great thing for cases, cold cases, and doing it friendly and civilly too. You're not arguing back and forth. You're not, shooting somebody down because they don't like your suspect. You know what I mean? It's an open discussion with no, anger. In the Zodiac case, we can compare it to, because there's so many different people that are just so honed in their suspect. If you say anything negative about their suspect at all, they'll jump down your throat. We didn't have any of that on Citizen Detective. So it was just friendly, open discussion, spitfiring ideas, theories, and really bringing up good questions in a group environment. And I think that's really cool. I think if you can do that for cold cases, you can make some headway and maybe just, help a case along. So we were fortunate enough to have different family members on of some of the victims, and different investigators. So I think the show is pretty original from that aspect, and people can go back and, I forget how many episodes we have done. I think we did 50 episodes or something, but people can go back and either watch the YouTube version or listen to the audio podcast.
Okay, yes, and I was a guest on the program, as you said, talking about the Texarkana Moonlight Murders, the Phantom Killer. And my experience with that was, I felt like I knew what I was talking about. I followed true crime stories for 30 years, just as somebody who watches them on the TV show. And as soon as I got on the Citizen Detective podcast, I realized, oh my goodness, I'm surrounded by real experts. Like the way that they talk about true crime is way more advanced than what I do here on Black Box Online Radio. That won't ever stop me from running my mouth on the internet. It's a livelihood. But I really did appreciate all of the expertise that everybody had there. I think that my two favorite episodes, it's kind of hard to say favorite, the ones that stood out to me the most were the Black Dahlia episode, the first one, and the Santa Rosa Hitchhiker Slayer episode, because here on Zodiac Monday, we often talk about the Santa Rosa hitchhiker slayings, and I was really, really caught on by some things that Dr. Lee Meller said when he was like, Arthur Lee Allen is the worst suspect for the Santa Rosa hitchhiker slayings. Graysmith wrote about this in Zodiac Unmasked, and Arthur Lee Allen's name comes up all the time in those discussions, and he's like, Arthur Lee Allen was a child molester. He targeted boys even, and there's absolutely no evidence that the Santa Rosa hitchhiker slayer targeted victims that young, as well as going after males. Period. He's just like the completely different type of person, and I mean, I found it to be very insightful.
Yeah, and I mean that's when you start analyzing, it's like every crime in California sometimes gets linked to Zodiac. It seems like, and there were so many different serial killers and predators back then. But to just link everything to Zodiac, it's when you talk to experts, somebody that's trained in that field or somebody that investigates them for a living, like Lee or Cloyd, for example, you learn that not everything can be attributed to the same person. There's different target types, there's different signatures, there's different, things like that. Again, Arthur Lee Allen attracted to kids, no evidence that Zodiac was that. So many people trying to link Joseph D'Angelo to the Zodiac. He's a someone that's a deviant, that is likes to inflict pain on people, is a sadist. It's the complete opposite of Zodiac. D'Angelo would spend hours with his victims. Zodiac got in and out as fast as possible. They're just two completely different people, and when you actually learn that stuff and you can spot the differences, it makes it easier because you're not wading through a million different suspects and saying, hey, this killer could be this killer. And it just makes it easier for you to sort of weed through some of that.
Well, thank you for that, Morph. And as the episode is winding down, I'm going to give you the floor. Do you have any final message for the listeners of Black Box Online Radio? Anything you'd like to promote? Anything new in the works? And where can people find your stuff?
Well, I mean, you can go to abjackentertainment.com, and that's got a list of all the different podcasts there. I'm associated with a lot of different ones. I shut down my Zodiac site, but I still, obviously talk about the case, discuss the case, and I may have a future, website open up again about the case. Of course, we have the Zodiac Speaking podcast, which we may do a new episode or updates in the future, so just keep an eye on that. But in the meantime, I'm glad that there's a place like yours, Ned, to keep the case going, keep the discussion going, and I'm happy to see that you keep digging, and I hope you continue to do it.
Mike Morford, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on, Ned.
And thank you once again to Mike Morford for appearing on the channel and talking about his Zodiac Killer suspect, William MacDuff Andrew. And right now I would like to get to your supporter shoutouts from buymeacoffee.com, and you can also use the super thanks on YouTube, as well as the super chats for the live streams every Tuesday and Thursday for the summer and early autumn, the autumn of terror, if we want to call it that. I will be going live Tuesdays and Thursdays at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. You can come on by for True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. But our first shout-out comes to us from Batman66. Batman66, thank you so much for your regular and consistent support. And Batman66 has also been helping out a lot with these shorts that come out here on YouTube Monday through Friday. You can also get them on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. On Instagram and TikTok, I am BlackBoxNed88. Our next one comes to us from River Prawn Pottery. You two guys have been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for everything. I really appreciate it. And we also have a shout out going to CZ Guy. CZ Guy has also become a regular and consistent supporter. Amazing stuff as well. And we have one from Sam Fisher. Sam Fisher is the author of the Zodiac Killer Identity, and he has made a new video about his Zodiac Killer suspect, Joseph Paul Franklin, and I am uploading these as references, and this one will come out next Sunday, so lots of things to pay attention to here on Black Box Online Radio. One more time, you can hit the like button and subscribe if you want to follow along with all of these true crime discussions. And I would like to give a shout out to Dennis G. Dennis G has been helping find a lot of the images that you see going by here on the screen, and also for the other episodes that come out on Wednesdays and Fridays, such as Ripper Wednesday talking about Jack the Ripper, and Cooper Friday talking about D.B. Cooper. And I also want to remind you guys that there is a fan page for Black Box Online Radio on Instagram, and you can get that under the name Not Ray Johnson. One more time, the BBOR fan page is available under the name Not Ray Johnson, and a collective shout out once again to all of the super chats that came in on the live streams. And to move on to the Zodiac Killer News Report segment, I would first like to just drop the announcements that there is a new episode of the Zodiac Killer Files on Ross Geraci's channel Planet X Filmworks, which I'll be discussing in a second. And there is a full set of videos now on Forrest Haggerty's YouTube channel. He originally started a 3-part series on the Zodiac Killer, and then he expanded that into 6 parts. And it appears that he's going to cover many different subjects on his YouTube channel. The only videos that I've seen from him are from these about the Zodiac Killer, and he expanded his 3-part series into a 6-part series, but that seems like a channel that covers all different types of subjects, and I will be responding to episode 4. And then we also have the book Obsessed, My Relentless Pursuit of the Zodiac Killer by Mark Hewitt has still recently come out, and I will be looking at some of the observations there, as well as responding to your requested topics. And I would actually like to begin by giving a shout out to Rich, who requested a response to Forrest Haggerty's channel, or at the very least sent me a copy of one of his videos, and Rich sent this into the Instagram page, blackboxonlineradio. Now, Forrest Haggerty, as I said, has 6 videos on the Zodiac Killer, and previously I had done a response to the first 3, so right now I would like to look at some of the observations that he made in his 4th episode, and this one focused on the Zodiac Killer suspect, Arthur Lee Allen, the prime suspect in the Zodiac mystery. His 3rd video focused on Lawrence Kane as a Zodiac suspect. Now, the Arthur Lee Allen episode heavily weighed down on Robert Graysmith's narrative, and a lot of the things that Forrest Haggerty was sharing in his presentation also just came from an individual, a witness named Donald Lee Cheney. Perhaps you've heard of him. And one thing I noticed is that Forrest Haggerty was accepting all of these stories that Don Cheney was saying as gospel. He was accepting them as established facts, but how on earth do you know that Don Cheney was telling the truth about these wild stories that he was sharing about Arthur Lee Allen? Talking about in January of 1969, Arthur Lee Allen had a conversation with Don Cheney that he was talking about his Zodiac watch and saying that he didn't like it, and he was going to hunt people for sport, and he was going to use the name Zodiac, and he was going to do this because he liked the story, The Most Dangerous Game, and he's just accepting all of these things as established facts. And I think you guys know my stance on the subject. I think that Donald Lee Cheney was more or less a liar, if we're going to be very clear about it. And Don Cheney was a liar. And, giving a shout out to Drew Beeson, author of Sighting In on the Zodiac Killer, he has gone through this numerous times about all of Don Cheney's lies. But in this specific video, I think that the only thing that stood out to me as a strong point that needs to be reinforced is that Arthur Lee Allen was not a dumb person, and it goes so far beyond having intellectual capabilities. It goes so far beyond IQ points and having the mental ability to learn. What I got from Forrest Haggerty's video is, he talks about how Arthur Lee Allen was working at a refinery in Pinole, California at one point in his life. And again, he's citing Robert Graysmith for this. I first heard this stuff from Graysmith. So Arthur Lee Allen works at the refinery as a chemist. And a lot of the Zodiac Killer's language represents something or someone who has a high understanding of chemistry. And Graysmith even says Arthur Lee Allen could have taught chemistry, and perhaps he did. Because, you look at stuff like the Zodiac Killer saying lines like, I am mildly serious to know how much money you have on my head, and Cereus is spelled Cerous, like the chemical compound Cereus oxalate. That's the one that Thomas Horn likes to zone in on all the time. And somebody like Arthur Lee Allen, who really did understand chemistry, would be the type of person to reshape the misspellings in a way with certain things that maybe he would know that had certain meaning to him. And, that's a strong point, and we have to give credit where credit is due. But as far as the stuff about just kind of accepting everything that Cheney said and Graysmith said, no, I don't think I'm going to do that. And a lot of people aren't impressed and convinced by this narrative that Arthur Lee Allen was the Zodiac Killer. And one of them was Mark Hewitt, author of Obsessed, the book that I was just talking about. And as I read through Mark Hewitt's book, which is a true crime memoir, he talks about how he was exploring the Zodiac Killer mystery. These were well before the days of social media, and he was looking at the prime suspect, Arthur Lee Allen, and simply not being very convinced by him. Then, after a while, a new suspect came on the scene, named Richard Gaikowski, and Mark Hewitt began looking at him as well. This is all in the book Obsessed, by the way, and he also wasn't completely convinced. But one thing that Mark Hewitt wanted to do was, he wanted to connect with people via correspondences. He wanted to explore the true crime world by actually connecting with the individuals who are in prison, and he states that perhaps one of the most life-changing correspondences that he had was with Charles Manson, actually. And this went on to become the foundation of Mark Hewitt's book, Charles Manson Behind Bars. But then he ultimately perhaps would have an even bigger connection to another real-life criminal named Ted Kaczynski, and Mark Hewitt would ultimately adopt Ted Kaczynski as his Zodiac Killer suspect. Now, out of all the people that I've mentioned, I'm not convinced that any of these people were the Zodiac Killer. Charles Manson is also a Zodiac suspect for the planning of the murders, mind you. But, I mean, it's just really interesting to see the thought processes that people have, and I do have to say that the book Obsessed is very fast-moving. I mean, anytime I get a chance to sit down, I can easily go through 30 pages in the blink of an eye, and, credit where credit is due. But I should also point out that this is a memoir, and it's talking about a lot of personal stories, and Mark Hewitt even reminds us of the days back when people used to use Yahoo Messenger as the primary way to communicate, and that just brought back something that I had forgotten about for years, and it really just does shock me how simple the world used to be, about how it used to be cool to talk on Yahoo Messenger. But one more time, the book is Obsessed by Mark Hewitt, Obsessed, My Relentless Pursuit of the Zodiac Killer. Next we have something from Glenn Collins. He sent this into the email address, blackboxonlineradio@AOL.com, and Glenn says, I used the 340 cipher key on the My Name Is cipher, and I was wondering if you could check my work. I figured Zodiac would use the same key where at the time the 340 wasn't solved. I'm sending you the key and my solution using that key. Thank you, Ned. I appreciate you. Sincerely, Glenn. And let's just look at some of the things that Glenn came up with here in this particular solution. Of course, the Zodiac Killer had 3 ciphers at this point, and then he would ultimately add a 4th, but he had 3 at this point. The 408 cipher, which was solved, the 340, which had not been solved at the time that this was mailed. Then the Zodiac Killer mails the Z13, which is the My Name Is cipher. Later on, he would mail the Z32. But you guys know the Z13 cipher. It goes AEN, Zodiac sign, circle date K, circle date M, circle date, what appears to be an anchor or an Aries sign, NAM. And the solution that Glenn came up with was Drea Aolido, and that is maybe something that I read way too fast. Drea is spelled D-R-E-A, and then there's a space, the letter A, space, the letter O, space, and then Lido is spelled L-E-D-O. And when I first read this, I immediately began to wonder, let's say hypothetically, if this were the correct solution to the Z13, then I would expect that the name Lido should come first, and then maybe O and A, and then Drea, Lido, O-A, Drea, almost like 2 initials in the middle. And if it were 1 initial in the middle, I would be a lot more convinced. But before I say anything else about Glenn Collins' solution to the Z13, I am just so surprised that he used the method of the 340 and achieved this solution, because there is another Zodiac sleuth out there named Faisal Zarawi, who is the author of the Zodiac Affair, and he is perhaps more famous for getting a lot of news coverage for attempting to solve the Z13 and Z32 cipher. And if I recall, it was the solution to the 340 is what tripped him up, or it's what set him off. Like, what I guess I would say it's what set off his chain reaction, rather. And that is that he thought the 340 has not been solved yet, so he's going to try to use a similar method to solve the Z13 and the Z32. But what Faisal did was he removed the letters and ultimately came up with the solution Kayr, Kayir, which he thought meant K, and his zodiac suspect is Lawrence Kane. But as far as this one here, I think that it's almost in line with what sounds like a name that an American would be using at the time, Lido Oe Drea, and almost but not quite. Now, let's say hypothetically, if Glenn is right, then the Zodiac Killer might be of Italian origin, just guessing by the way that this sounds. But I do think that it's very notable and noteworthy that Glenn is using the circled eights as spaces. That's something that I thought about for a very long time. Even if you go back and listen to my old episodes from 2020, I was heavily entertaining this possibility that the Zodiac was using the circled eights as spaces. Well, what would that mean if he were? Then that would strongly suggest that the K and the M were representing two standalone letters, and then that's why you would have the A and the O in the middle. I also think that that is something that is completely consistent and it makes sense. But, Lido Drea would also work as a solution. The A and the O here, though, I mean, I think that it's going to go into the category of maybe going down the right track, but not 100% spot on. However, Glenn did send me something else that I would like to discuss with you guys here on Zodiac Monday. And firstly, this is relating to the Gnostic Cross. And Glenn says this one: "Hello, Ned. I hope you're doing well. This is Glenn, one of your fans. I found some interesting information on the Zodiac Cross, and I thought you might want to talk about it on one of your videos. I didn't get to do too much research on it yet, but I would love your input." And Glenn sent me a photo of the Gnostic Cross. And I'm not going to lie to you guys, I was a little bit skeptical going into this one because I've looked at some other examples of crosses that could have been used for the zodiac symbol. You guys might remember I did a very big piece on the Celtic cross in the past. There's also the Sun cross and the Earth cross. And with the Celtic cross, I wasn't extremely convinced. When I first saw the Zodiac Killer symbol on America's Most Wanted years ago when I was a kid, I was like, that's the scope of a gun. And I didn't think that that was up for dispute. I didn't think that that was something questionable. I thought that was the scope of the gun because they're saying that this guy is hunting people for sport, and you hunt people with a rifle and you use the scope, and I think you can follow that train of thought. However, ultimately, I think my first instincts were wrong. Maybe something that's a little bit more convincing is the Zodiac watch, or just the entire concept of the astrological zodiac that uses a similar symbol. So I was a little bit pessimistic going into this one, but I found an article by Bob D. on IPBhost.com, just citing the source, talking about the meaning of the Gnostic cross. And you might be noticing that, yes, it has the cross the way that lots of Christian symbols do, but it also has the circle. And the explanation provided is that the circle represents eternal life, and it also represents the light. And interestingly, citing the article as well, it talks about how in nature a rainbow forms into a circle when it's not interrupted by the horizon, and this is true. I remember the first time I saw a rainbow from the air. I was on an airplane and I saw a rainbow and it formed into a perfect circle, and I was just thinking, wow, why didn't nobody tell me about this? Why didn't a single person ever tell me this? Now I'm never going to get those lucky charms. But I digress from that, and more importantly, it represents light and eternal life. Now, what's the Zodiac Killer always talking about? Paradise. When I die, I will be reborn in paradise, and those whom I have killed will be my slaves. That's what the Zodiac Killer wrote in his very first cipher, the 408. And also, the Zodiac used this multiple times. He used the same type of language in the 340 cipher. He used the same type of language on the Halloween card that says Slaves Paradise at an intersection. The Zodiac Killer is talking about being reborn in paradise. And then you can see the cross, of course, representing the crucifixion. And, there could be something here. This article also talks about how there is another similar cross called the Ankh, which has the circle representing femininity and the cross representing masculinity. But according to the verbiage of this article, there's just one sentence that says they look similar, but they are not identical. I mean, masculine and feminine coming together, domination, maybe that would be some type of influence. But the thing about eternal life and using that symbol to represent some type of eternal life, I could actually see the Zodiac Killer doing something like that. So congrats, Glenn Collins. I think this is a good find. But more importantly, do I believe that the Zodiac Killer was a Christian? Perhaps. Lots of Americans grow up as Christians. Do I think the Zodiac Killer cared about Christianity? No. Negatory. Absolutely not. I don't think the Zodiac Killer cared about anything other than himself, even if he was a churchgoer. Lots of serial killers are churchgoers. That doesn't mean anything, really. That's just somebody who is trying to put on the facade of being non-threatening. Even if he was some type of person who was infatuated with symbols, like, let's say, for example, the Gnostic cross, the Celtic cross, or the Sun cross, I think that would have been purely for his own entertainment and own curiosities, and I really don't think the Zodiac Killer had a whole lot of depth to himself. I think he wanted to make people think that he was, in his own narcissistic way. He's trying to deceive people into thinking that he's somebody who's really cool, but in reality, he is what Patton Oswalt would call a serial killer zilch. Just my take on the subject, but I don't mean to be nasty or anything. Okay, now, I told you guys that there was a new episode of the Zodiac Killer Files on Planet X Filmworks, and Ross Geraci hosts that program, and he was joined by two people, Dion and Craig. Craig is known by Craggle in the Zodiac world, and Dion is Dion Walker, and he's somebody whom I really wanted to hear from, because he has talked about what's called the full circle theory, which I think has now been renamed the perfect circle theory, and he wrote a very interesting essay about it, looking at the Zodiac Killer's activities. The first crime that has been attributed to the Zodiac Killer is the Lake Herman Road murders on December 20th of 1968, but Dion's perfect circle theory actually goes back to 1962 with the murder of Ray Davis, and he looks at how there could be a type of mirroring that is going on in the Zodiac world, a full circle process, murdering a cab driver in 1962, committing a double homicide by the waterfront in 1963 with the Domingos Edwards murders. Then you have the Swindle murders in 64, the murder of Sherry Jo Bates, which I guess would be the complete 180 degrees. And then you would have the Lake Herman Road murders in 68, the Blue Rock Springs shooting in 69, and then the Lake Berryessa stabbing is meant to mirror the Domingos Edwards murders of 63, double homicide with gun knife, pre-cut lengths of rope, and then finally the murder of Paul Stein, the taxi driver, where Paul Stein is killed in a very similar way that Ray Davis is killed. And the murderer of Ray Davis also made taunting phone calls. He also made threats to attack a bus. Then the Zodiac famously said he was going to attack a bus with a bomb. So you can see that there are lots of similarities among these crimes that are widely discussed, and I do appreciate the observations. Now, some of my big takeaways from this episode, the Zodiac Killer Files with Dion and Craig, was that they were talking about the Zodiac Killer's Halloween card. In 1970, the Zodiac Killer would mail the Halloween card to Paul Avery, and these guys really had their stuff down in terms of the articles that could have influenced or inspired the Zodiac Killer to create certain creations, if you will, because the Zodiac's creations are beyond just letters and cards. He also made diagrams and cryptograms. But one of the inspirations for the Halloween card could have been talking about a murder that took place in 1970, and it was the murder of an individual named Jackie Truss. And firstly, Paul Avery, the reporter who closely followed the Zodiac case, was someone who wrote an article referring to this crime as a Jack the Ripper-style murder. And if you want to read anything about the Zodiac Killer, you should go over to zodiacciphers.com, run by Richard Grinnell. He always has an article on everything, and I'm going to look at that right now. And it says, by Paul Avery, a Jack the Ripper who has savagely slain 3 young black girls apparently is at large in San Francisco. Like the infamous London murderer of the last century, this killer has only chosen streetwalkers to be his victims. Since the grisly discovery of 16-year-old Jackie Truss in Presidio Heights on Saturday, terrified Fillmore prostitutes have been playing their trade in pairs. And there are a couple reasons for this, about why this could be an inspiration for the Halloween card. Richard even has an intro written out here. On the morning of October 27, 1970, the San Francisco Chronicle featured an article by Paul Avery entitled, a Jack the Ripper theory on slayings, highlighting the recent murder of Jackie Truss, age 16, on October 24th of 1970, whose tortured, slashed, and beaten body was discovered in the early morning hours on the tree-lined Laurel Street between Jackson and Pacific Streets in Presidio Heights. She had ligature marks on her wrists, her throat and eyelids were slit with a knife, and she had been partially disemboweled, and her killer had tortured her by fire. So the Zodiac wrote the Halloween card that says by rope, by knife, by gun, by fire, and it says Slave's Paradise. So these methods are all used in the murder of Jackie Truss. Jackie Truss was third in a series of similar murders, beginning with Brenda Joyce Vance, age 23, on August 4th of 1970, who had been tortured, burnt, and bludgeoned to death, and found on the sidewalk of Golden Gate Avenue. On August 30th of 1970, Janice Smith was discovered in a condemned dwelling on Webster Street, having been tied, slashed with a long blade dagger, and burnt. In 1973, somebody was eventually charged with the first two murders, and was thought to be responsible for the third. The final murder was unlikely to have been committed by the Zodiac Killer, but he did mail the Halloween card to Paul Avery on the afternoon of October 27th, 1970, in response to the newspaper article from that morning that said, a Jack the Ripper theory on slayings. And there's a question mark at the end of that, because I think Richard Grinnell is being very fair and honest. He doesn't necessarily know if the Zodiac Killer did indeed use that as the inspiration for the Halloween card. This thing about how there could be another Jack the Ripper style murderer out there, and is that guy going to be stealing his thunder or something like that? But I mean, it makes sense. It sounds like something that the Zodiac Killer would do. I also agree with Richard, as well as the panel that was discussing this, that this crime doesn't seem like anything like the Zodiac Killer's activities. Now, would the Zodiac Killer leave allusions to these possible crimes, or could it have influenced him in some way? Yes, of course, because the Zodiac Killer most likely knew about the death wheel, by rope, by knife, by gun, by fire. He probably remembered it from a Tim Holt comic, and then reading the story about Jackie Truss in the paper, as well as perhaps being an avid reader of newspapers, going all the way back to August 4th of 1970. And, I mean, I think the Zodiac closely followed the news, and I'm almost certain that the Zodiac would have closely followed the newspapers from July 4th and 5th of 1969 all the way into 1971. I think he was looking for his name every single day, and I don't even think that's up for discussion. Yes, I think the Zodiac Killer would have been doing that. So he might see something about somebody who is another serial killer that is operating. And by the way, this happens very frequently. This happens very frequently, that multiple serial killers are operating at the same time, and sometimes they do in similar ways. I can give you countless examples on some of my other episodes, whether it's Jack the Ripper and the Thames Torso Killer, or the Long Island serial killer and the murderer John Bittrell, who are committing crimes in similar ways. I mean, this is not like an isolated incident of another serial killer, or perhaps just serial murders being committed on the loose. But, I mean, this definitely does sound like a possible reason why the Zodiac Killer chose to mail the Halloween card at that time. Now, as far as the location goes, as it says here, in Presidio Heights on Saturday, terrified Fillmore prostitutes have been plying their trade in pairs. A couple years ago, somebody sent me an interview with a pimp named Fillmore Slim. I had never heard of him before. I knew nothing about this stuff, and he was just talking about being a pimp in the early 1970s, and they wanted me to pay attention to a specific portion of the interview when he talks about how one of his girls was killed by the Zodiac Killer. And the interviewer actually asked him that, hey, wasn't one of your girls killed by the Zodiac Killer? And he's like, oh yeah, like the Zodiac hung her upside down and drained all the blood out of her. And I turned it off, to be honest. I was like, what's he talking about? I mean, firstly, I was like, the Zodiac Killer didn't commit crimes that way. Secondarily, I just thought that he was completely mistaken or out of his mind. But it sounds like he was referring to one of these crimes here, one of these 3 murders that took place in 1970. The murders of Joyce Vance, Janice Smith, and of Jackie Truss. So I just wanted to point that out, that these crimes have come up in Zodiac Killer discussions, even though there's a very low chance that the Zodiac actually committed these crimes. It's more likely than not that he just simply wanted to exploit them for newspaper coverage. But what do you think? I would love to know what you guys would have to say. Once again, thanks to Mike Morford, and you guys can put anything you want in the comments section about Zodiac Killer suspect MacDuff. Please visit Ross Geraci's channel, Planet X Filmworks. Please visit Forrest Haggerty's channel for his 6-part series on the Zodiac Killer. And thank you to everyone who sent thanks in to the Instagram page and the email address, blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. My Facebook name is Ned DeHaan, BlackboxNed88 on TikTok as well. And I will see you guys tomorrow for True Crime Talk Radio in the morning. Goodbye.